Today I'm breaking down the cinematic trailer Welcome to Noxus for League of Legends as a professional concept artist. This video is going to be completely different from anything I have done before in this channel. I'm going to do, I don't want to call it a reaction video because I already watched it, but I'm going to do sort of like a breakdown of the cinematic trailer. This is something that I always do. Everything something like this comes out, I always want to take a look at it, enjoy it, of course, and being entertained by all these beautiful cinematics from games or trailers from movies. But I always like to go back, especially with something like this, and try to break down and reverse engineer some of the things that I see visually to see if I can learn something from it as an artist. Arcane is one of those IPs where the artwork and everything that they do visually and artistically is just amazing. I really enjoy it. Now, I play League of Legends, but I don't play for ranks or anything like that. I just play casually, so I'm not a super avid player of it. However, I do know the champions, 99% of them. I don't know much about the actual lore of the whole world. Now, I do know a little bit about it. I know some of the places, some of the characters from each of the places. I know about Noxus and the characters that you will see here in the cinematic, so I'm super excited about it. What I want to do is sort of like watch it through. I'm gonna make a couple pauses. This is probably the third time that I've watched this, so it's not gonna be like a super live reaction on it, and also make some notes, and then we'll come back and break down some of the specific shots that I want to sort of break down. The main reason for this is to give you sort of like an idea of what goes in my mind when I do this by myself, just to kind of show you. And if you guys like this, I can continue doing this every time something like this comes out. Stay tuned. I'm gonna start this, and then we'll sort of break it down and see what we can get.
Noxus is where the strong.
So I didn't know that we're gonna make this in the Arcane style when I watched it, so it was a great surprise.
And defiant, calling them here to answer one simple question.
I think this is relevant to Kindra's Wolf. I love this shot, it's so good. Simple shot, but works. Love the texture that they have on those walls there. Really integrate. Here's young Darius. I love that they did like a younger version. And Toronto, that looks so good. Now there's a lot of characters here I just hate in the game, but I love this. So in this, the Black Rose. The cinematography on these trailers or cinematics is just so good, from the music, the sound effects, of course the artwork itself. And the way they introduce each character is really entertaining as well. So Liz. Now this part here, I mean, this is crazy the way they did. This was more like a show-off thing, because you usually don't get this type of scenes like this with no music or anything like that. This is almost like you're watching an episode from Arcane, which is a great thing. They might be doing this just to give you a little tease of what's coming. And there's so many little details. I'm actually picking up on some details that I didn't even pick up the first two times that I watched this. Love that texture on the ground. And the way they picked, I don't know if they actually do this in 3D or 2D, but the technique that they're using for getting the texture on these materials is really good. I wonder, in any of you League of Legends super fans that know the lore, I don't know if Mel is anything related to Senna. Would be pretty cool. I never noticed how Catalina here shifts to the other blade, just like in the game, which is amazing. And Mel is just so OP. So good. I love that character. Yeah, it's also great how, and you can notice this too, like how each of these locations and scenes have their own color palette, which is great for separating these locations and what's happening in the scene. Like how they're taking Trundle out of there. It's not, doesn't seem like he's actually dead. I love how they animated the wind through the fields there. It's like a very small little touch that they did. I don't know how they did it, but now I thought it was over, but it seems that, well, there's a next part here, which is, I was kind of intrigued by it to be able to see this. I didn't know. You guys can let me know if you guys know more about the lore here, but it was great seeing LeBlanc here, like her actual face, and Vlad. I didn't know there were a thing, or they were together or something. And I'm wondering if that's actually that marking there is in reference to Kindred's wolf thing, which will be great to see how they incorporate it into the story.
Piltover was a lesson, Vladimir. Calamity is always approaching. In some moments, its arrival is more imminent than others. Our next move must be bolder.
Yeah, I don't know what this means, but
safer.
that's pretty cool. Okay, so what I did was I picked up a few screenshots from the actual video. Very quickly, again, this is something I'm not going to spend hours on this, right? But I always like to, spend a little time to really try to figure things out, because every once in a while you see a movie or you see a trailer like this one or some sort of artwork that even if you are a professional or you have been doing art for a little while, you still can figure out how they did certain things, right? And so this is always also a good time for you to spend and figure out, the things that are working and not working. And so I have this shot here, and I want to start with this one, right? So I always start with the big things, right? The fundamentals of it, the composition, the value composition, the colors that they're using, how they're painting things or how they're modeling things. And, straightforward from all the shows that we're going to go over here, composition-wise, it's not very extravagant. It's not really super dynamic in most cases, right? You take a shot like this and the composition is pretty straightforward, right? It's very simple to understand, and I'm going to make some sort of random quote-unquote notes here just so you can actually see what I'm thinking or what I'm saying. Right, so the horizon line is not dead in the center, right? It's a little bit lower than that, which is great, a great choice. This mountain here, the shape is pretty easy to understand, right? And it goes a little bit further. I don't know exactly where the center is, but we have this going a little bit heavier on the right side, right? And it's a little bit more open here on the left side. So those are like the very, very general things. But the main thing that I want to concentrate is that even though, and I'm not going to talk about the actual animated part of this, but if we take a look at the mountain, for example, right, I can see that, we'll take a look at just this part here. We can see that it's mostly in shadow, right? There's only a few spots here that are in light, maybe here, and, on the rocks as well here. Right, so mainly this whole mountain is in shadow, which is great for many things, right? It helps popping the character out when the character has some highlights on. And the other thing is that you can see that even though it's only in shadow, there's a lot of detail, and this is going to be probably the most talk thing about this in this video about this. But you can see all this different mark. It's not really a flat value or a flat color. And if I turn this to black and white, you can see that there's all these different little details that you can see, right? From here to here to here to all this texture that is either painted or rendered. I don't know exactly how they do it. We can always sort of like mimic it, right? But there's all this detail in this shadow shape that makes it look more interesting. And one of the key points that I want you to think about is the intentional purpose of the detail that you're adding in those shapes, whether it's in the light shapes or in the shadow shapes. And they do it in this case in the shadow shapes, but the control position of this and the control use of value of these details. Now, if I go to the grayscale slider, right, and I sort of move around, right, this whole area, you're gonna see here that the cursor doesn't go really far from the center. It sort of stays in here, right? You can see that there, right? Unless I go to like the light side here, you can see how it goes to light. But here on the shadow area, it sort of stays control in that section, which is extremely important, right? Because once you start getting out of there, then it starts getting a little bit too contrasty and outside of that fundamental shape of shadow. And so that tells me that even though they have all these detail, they control how much of that range they're using. And of course, the color, you can go a little bit even crazier than that, right? So you could have all these colors that they have here. And if we go to the, let's go to the section here, CMYK. You can see that the sliders of the color actually move quite a bit more. But the value one, which is the more important one, stays more control. And I think that's like that's such a huge thing to understand and to apply to your own work, which is great. We'll talk more about that, but that's like the main thing, right? And, you know, black and white, you know, so we can see that a little bit better. The same thing goes with this background here, the same thing, right? If you go here, the composition is pretty straightforward composition. The atmospheric perspective is pretty straightforward, right? So, you know, we have the lightest values here in the back and less contrast as it goes forward, right? So there's more contrast down here. And so we can easily see that. But now you can see, if I go to this section here, you can see how they make a value or a hue color change in this area from this material to this material, right? Well, there's like, maybe that's grass and the rock. But if I change that to black and white, you can see that the value is literally almost the same, right? So that way they're sort of keeping the less contrast controlled, but they're giving it an extra level of detail by changing the hue and giving it another material while keeping the same value, local value of the mountain, which is a great thing to do, especially for detailing things that are further in the back. But again, it's a pretty similar approach to like this one here, right? So we're gonna see that more on this as well. We'll talk more about that. But this is the other shot, right? And again, I always like to look at it in black and white to kind of isolate those values and try to understand it. But this is a pretty simple shot. However, the other key point that I want to talk about is that the overcomplication or oversimplification, or how to simplify the design of things that you're designing. And if we take this structure, for example, the main shape of the structure is literally a cube, right? It's very simple, right? It's very simple. And I think in most cases, or in a lot of times, us artists, that we want to overcomplicate things, right? We want to design the craziest, most unique shape for this particular thing, and we don't really have to 98% of the time, right? And this is a great example of this, where they take a very simple shape like this for this structure, but they make it interesting by doing other things, right? And one of those things is they did many things, but one of those things is the texture of it, right? So we can see a very nice gradation of two different textures from the bottom to the top. Now, the reason why I know, or you know, it's another texture is this obviously in the color, but also on the value, on the local value of that structure. So we can see that it has a lighter local value down here, right? And then it's almost like chipping away to this under layer of material that it has, right? Which is a great decision for this, right? So they're doing that with the material, but they're also doing it with the details that they're putting inside the shape. I want to dive a little bit more into that, but the other thing that as I was looking into this shot is like the way that they're painting or rendering some of these shots. Now, I don't know exactly what their pipeline is, if everything is in 3D or 2D, right? I can only sort of try to decompress it and reverse engineer it so I can replicate it or mimic it, right? And so I was looking at these rocks and grass and all these different elements here, and I can tell by so especially some of the lighter areas here and on the rocks as well, all this sort of like way that they're rendering these things and some of these shapes that they have on the grass, right? Like that. And we're gonna see that a little bit more on another shot, but I noticed that they have this sort of like style into the render, which is kind of cool. And I think the reason why it's successful is because they control the value of it, right? It's very similar to the previous shot where we're on the beach here. You know, they have all these different lines and marks and shapes and texture, but they control the value, which is I think why it is successful. And that reminded me of a artist that I always watch his black and white sketches. His name is Gui Yuan, right? And he does a very similar thing, a little bit rougher, right? But it's sort of like the same idea where he has all these black and white sketches and he makes this sort of marks around, right? Almost like he doesn't lift up his pencil, right? And he just continues doing those marks in there, right? Of course, with some purpose behind it, but also the main thing is to control the value of it, right? And you can see it here. But I think that's a great way to make it look sort of like different, but also adding detail without making it too, without overcomplicating the contrast or the zone of shadow or light that you're working on. And you can also see it here. And there's a lot. This was a low-res image, but you can see it a lot in here. But because of the values I control, it looks successful. And so I always go back here as well, and I can see that they do sort of like a similar thing here to bring more details into the shot, right? Now for this, we come back here. I was talking about the general big shape, simple shape of this structure, but they're making it unique and more interesting by playing with the materials and also the interior of the shape, right? So if I have the shape, which is this right here, whatever I do inside while keeping the same shape or keeping the silhouette intact is what's going to make it a little bit more interesting, right? And you can see it by all this. And I grabbed a couple shots that have the details inside of that structure, right? Which is all these engravings and different levels of detail here, right? That are making it look more interesting, right? In here as well, right? And that's what it's sort of like, it's making it interesting while keeping the same general simple shape. You can see how they're playing with the texture here. It's kind of cool, right? And so I always try to think about, having a readable shapes when I'm designing things as much as I can. And then trying to implement this idea of then let's put the detail inside that shape to make it look more interesting. You guys also see that here, right? This is a very simple setup, right? If I see this on 3D, right? They probably don't even have this individual like planks of wood, right? But this is a very simple shape in terms of the outside big shape of this elements here. But what's inside is what's making it more interesting, right? We got this sort of like marble sort of texture in here, but also even in something more simple where you have this planks going around, they are having slightly different value changes and hue changes, right? So we have some purple here, we got some lighter tones here, darker tones here, right? And so we don't have to overcomplicate the big shape, but we can always add details into those. If you see this in black and white, right? You can see how the local values of the wood are darker than your marble, right? But also the values inside are controlled in that small range, and you can see it here, right? If I go around, they're very controlled. If I go to the marble, then it goes a little bit crazy because of the nature of the material. But controlling that range is so important, so important. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is trying to dissect some of the painting techniques or texture here. I was looking at this image here, and again, very straightforward shot, but I believe it's harder to make something like this interesting. And yes, we have this sort of structure here, right, which we talked about already. But then you have this huge plane here of almost the same material. And sometimes it's harder to make this area interesting because you have to play with texture and not so much color. But there's nothing, you don't want to also over detail some of these areas, right? And I was zooming in and I was looking at all these shapes and all these things, and it reminded me of a filter in Photoshop. But I was noticing that you have the shape like this, right? But then there's like a darker line around it, right? You have a lighter shape and a darker line around it, and you can see that all throughout in here. And maybe they do this, maybe they don't, I'm not sure. I can only sort of like guess. But that reminded me of a fine edges sort of Photoshop filter. And I have here this is like a concept that I'm working for, a wall building place that I'm doing. And I was like, oh, maybe I can try something really quick just to kind of see if that's going to work. And so if you take your layer, go to filter, stylize, fine edges, you get this like weird thing, which doesn't really do much. And you can always play with the values, right? So maybe you can clean it up a little bit. And I think this is going to look different whether you have it from an actual 3D render or if you actually like paint, right? So maybe you can paint the actual texture on the image and then do this. That might be something to try out. And you can get that image and then try with the play with the blending mode. So I have this one on lightened, right? And I went into my blend if modes and I deleted or blend all my darker values in here just so I could have just a few of the lighter ones, right? Like so. And so if I zoom in and out, I'm getting some of that in some of these areas here, right? And I can always come back in and maybe even play with that sort of technique that we were talking about, going around. I do want to be careful about the values, that I don't go too crazy with it, but I'm sort of peeking from what I already have in here and going around and maybe getting something similar, like a similar look from that, right? And I'll probably do that all throughout the image as I'm working on it. And so I don't need to do it to the whole image, right? I just need to know that the way that I need to do it in order to get the actual effect, right? And so little by little, it start building up. But again, I want to make sure that I control the local value range in there. And again, it's very subtle, right? Most people won't recognize that, but subconsciously, I think it's going to make a difference when people look at it without them knowing exactly what you did, right? And of course, you don't want to go crazy with this everywhere, right? You just want to have it strategically in certain areas, but you want to make sure that you get that into your piece. And I think this is also a great way to break out the 3D-ness of your render. And I'm mainly just using a hard brush. There's no texture or anything in here, because you're creating the texture with the brush. Go back and forth and see. If I only look at this area here, right? I think that's working really well. All right, guys, so I hope that was helpful for you guys. Again, this is something that I do pretty much all the time that something like this comes out. I spend a few minutes, maybe 20, 30 minutes to kind of try to learn something of it or learn something new by observing and trying to reverse engineer what I'm seeing. And you could do that with painting, you could do that with 3D, with textures, material, composition, all that. And so I think this is probably one of the best ways for me that works for me to learn something new and study and actually study. And so I always try to do this as much as possible when I can. So I really hope that helps. If you like this content, let me know in the comment section below, because I would love to keep doing this if you guys like it. And if you like the content on my channel, please feel free to subscribe and share it with your friends. I'll see you in the next one.